Hello, I hope this story makes you think about how easy it is to lose control of your own life. Your feedback, comments, and subscriptions are always welcome. Margaret started her day as usual. She was enjoying her morning coffee in her favorite chair by the window. Her home, built by her late husband, was not only a place to live, but also a place of memories and comfort. But this morning, something strange disturbed her peace. As she was looking for tax documents in a drawer, when she noticed an envelope with someone else's name on it. The sender was a lawyer she had never heard of. Her heart beat faster. Something was wrong. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a will, her will. But the text she read made her freeze. Her heart stopped for a moment. James, her son-in-law. She couldn't believe her eyes. Oh, it was her signature, but she had definitely not signed such a document. This must be a mistake, Margaret thought. But the more she looked at the text, the more she realized that this was no joke. Oh, the date, the signature, everything looked real. She remembered how a few months ago James had offered to help her with her financial documents. He said that everything will be easier if you put things in order now. He couldn't have done that on purpose, or could he? She thought. Margaret began to pace nervously around the room, her mind racing. How did this happen? Why didn't she notice anything? And most importantly, what should she do now? She decided to check the rest of the documents. But the more she searched, the more suspicious papers she found. Changes in real estate ownership, additional agreements, all of this had been done without her knowledge. I have to do something, she finally said out loud. Margaret's first thought was to call her daughter Emily. But when she dialed the number, the voice on the other end was cold. Mom, I'm busy right now. Can we talk later? Said Emily. It's urgent, Emily. It's about the will, Margaret insisted. The will. James already explained everything. He said you agreed to it. You did agree. Margaret was at a loss for words. She realized that Emily not only knew about it, but also supported her husband. After talking to her daughter, Margaret felt betrayed. Her own family, the one she trusted the most, had taken advantage of her trust. She realized that this was only the beginning. She needed to learn more before she could act. But how? Her hands were tied, and she didn't even know who to turn to. Margaret was left alone with her thoughts. She looked at the documents in front of her and realized that this was not just a legal mistake. This was a betrayal she had never expected. Margaret had devoted her entire life to her family. After the loss of her husband, she focused on raising her only daughter, Emily, and her home was full of fond memories, and everything in it reminded her of her life with her husband. Emily was her raison d'etre. Margaret invested everything in her time, energy, money. She always dreamed that her daughter would have more opportunities than she did. When Emily grew up and met James, Margaret accepted him as part of the family. James seemed like a polite, hardworking man who cared about her daughter. Margaret believed that Emily had found true happiness. James was a man who always talked about plans for the future. He worked in real estate and often talked about his big ideas. His energy and self-confidence were admirable, although at times his ambition seemed too bold. Margaret noticed that James liked to be in control. He always wanted to be the center of attention and convinced everyone that he was right. But because he was Emily's husband, Margaret never questioned his intentions. Emily had always been close to her mother. She shared all her experiences and successes with Margaret. Their relationship was trusting and warm. But after the marriage, Emily began to change. She began to visit her mother less often and avoid frank conversations. Margaret explained this by her new responsibilities in family life. But in her heart, she felt that something was wrong. Emily often defended James, even when his decisions seemed illogical. She began to distance herself from her mother, gradually building a new world around her husband. One day, James suggested that Margaret put her financial affairs in order. He explained that he wanted to make her life easier. I just want to help, he said. Margaret reluctantly agreed because she trusted him as part of the family. She signed the documents without looking into the details because she believed that James had her best interest at heart. But sometimes Margaret noticed that Emily looked anxious when it came to finances. Mom, James knows what he's doing," she said one day, but there was something in her voice that made Margaret uneasy. Their family seemed to live in harmony. They spent holidays together, discussed plans for the future, and laughed at the dinner table. But behind this outward appearance were hints of distrust and manipulation. Margaret did not want to believe that anything could go wrong. She convinced herself that all her doubts were just excessive suspicion. After Margaret came across the documents, her heart sank. The will had been changed so that her entire inheritance now belonged to James's family. And her property, money, and even her personal valuables were now under the control of her son-in-law. How could this happen, she thought. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, sitting in the kitchen, Margaret looked through the papers, trying to find clues. She noticed that her signature was there, but she couldn't remember when she had signed it. I'm not gonna let this go, she decided. The next morning, Margaret went to see her old lawyer friend, Mr. Raymond. He was experienced and always willing to help. Raymond looked at the documents carefully and immediately realized that it was a fraud. "Margaret, it looks like you were tricked into signing these papers," he said. "How could this happen?" I trusted them," Margaret replied, barely holding back her tears. Raymond explained that the changes to the will may have been made under the pretext of helping her, but the real goal was to take all her assets. Margaret decided to talk to her daughter. She hoped that Emily not know anything about James' machinations, but the conversation turned out to be difficult. "Emily, I found these documents." "What's going on?" she asked. Emily looked down nervously. "Mom, James just wanted to make sure everything was under control. He said it was for your safety." "My safety? He owns my property now. Is that what safety looks like to you?" Emily looked confused but avoided answering directly. Margaret returned home and decided to find more evidence. She started looking through old documents, emails, and messages. Her suspicions were confirmed when she came across a message from James in which he wrote, "This is the best way to organize everything, otherwise there could be problems." She also recalled a strange conversation she had with him a few months ago. He had insisted that she needed to modernize her legal documents, but hadn't explained the details. Margaret decided to share her situation with her friends. They supported her and advised her to contact financial investigators. One of her friends even told her that she had heard about a similar case in her city. "Margaret, you have to fight. It's your right," said her close friend Susan. Margaret felt that she was on the verge of an important discovery. She decided to find out how James could have convinced her to sign the documents. She needed more evidence to prove his guilt. Margaret sat in Mr. Raymond's office, holding the new documents that confirmed her suspicions. Raymond began to analyze in detail the financial transactions related to James. There are several large transfers here to an account that doesn't appear to be his own," Raymond said, pointing to the numbers. "Who was he transferring this money to?" asked Margaret. It could be someone in his family or partners. We need to investigate that." Margaret realized that her son-in-law was using her resources to cover some debts or finance outside projects. Margaret decided to talk to Emily again, but this time she was prepared. "Emily, I need the truth. Why did James decide to change his will?" Her voice was firm. Emily tried to defend her husband. "He just wanted to make sure everything was going to be okay. You know he works hard and wants to protect his family. But what does that have to do with giving my property to his family?" Why didn't he talk to me?" Emily hesitated and said quietly. "He said you might have health problems and might make rash decisions." Margaret realized that her daughter did not know the whole truth. She decided to confront James directly. "James, we need to talk," she said when he came to dinner. He smiled, but his eyes flashed with concern. "I found the documents that you executed behind my back. Why did you do that?" James tried to remain calm. Margaret, it's just a formality. You know I care about your safety. But why does my property belong to your family now? Do you even realize how this looks? His smile disappeared. This was in debt, and this was the only way to keep the business going. I thought I could fix it quickly. James began to tell me how his business got into trouble a few years ago. His partner ran off with a large sum of money, leaving James with obligations to creditors. I thought I could get things back on track, but things just kept getting worse. I didn't want Emily or the kids to suffer, he said. But you used my property without even asking permission. It wasn't your decision. Margaret was outraged. James tried to shift responsibility to circumstances. He said that he wanted to protect the family from bankruptcy and believed that Margaret would not use her resources in the near future anyway. I thought you would understand when you found out, he said. But you didn't even give me a chance to speak up. You just decided for me. Her voice trembling with emotion. Margaret felt a mixture of anger and frustration rising in her heart. She realized that her trust did not matter to James if it was for his own benefit. After the confrontation with James, Margaret decided to talk to Emily. She realized that her daughter deserved to know the truth, even if it would lead to conflict. Emily, I need to talk to you. It's about James, Margaret began, sitting down next to her daughter on the couch. Emily sighed, but did not look up. Mom, if you're talking about those documents again, I can't listen to this. You've just got it all wrong. No, Emily, I know that James changed my will without my permission. I have proof. Her voice trembled, but she was determined. Emily stood up abruptly. Mom, why do you always think the worst of James? He does everything for our family. If he made a decision, it was for our good. For your good. He's basically robbed me of everything I've been saving up for my whole life. Don't you realize that? Emily crossed her arms over her chest. Maybe you don't realize how hard our lives are. We have threes. James works 7 days a week. Sometimes you have to take risks. Margaret could not believe her ears. She saw her daughter, whom she had always supported, choosing her husband's side without even listening to the whole story. The conversation turned into a quarrel. Emily defended her husband, even when the facts were obvious. You don't realize that he did it for us. For me and for your grandchildren, Emily shouted. But why at my expense? Why without my permission? It was my decision, not his. Emily shook her head. You always think only of yourself. Can't you see that he was just trying to save our family? It's not saving, Emily. It's a betrayal. He stole my life from me. Margaret's voice trembled with emotion. After this conversation, Margaret felt a deep gap form between her and her daughter. Emily did not even try to understand her feelings. I think you've forgotten who was always there for you when you needed it, Margaret said, trying to hold back her tears. And you forget that James is part of our family. And he's my husband, and I support him, Emily replied, looking at her mother with a challenge. Margaret realized that she could no longer count on her daughter's support. That evening, Margaret left her daughter's home with a heavy heart. She realized that Emily had made her choice, and it was not in her favor. Margaret sat in her chair, clutching the evidence folder. Her heart was pounding, but she knew this moment was inevitable. She couldn't wait any longer. She called James's. I need to talk to you. Right now. On the other end of the line, James' voice was cold. I'm busy. Margaret, can we discuss this later? No. This concerns my property and your fraud. Gonna meet me at my house. Her voice was firm, even though she was shaking inside. An hour later, James appeared on the doorstep. He looked reserved, but Margaret could see a hint of anxiety in his eyes. Well, what do you want? Margaret. What am I being accused of this time? He sat down in a chair, crossing his arms. This time. James, you have outdone yourself. How dare you change my will without my permission? She put the folder on the table. Know what you're talking about. James tried to feign indifference, but his voice was trembling. Margaret opened the folder and pulled out copies of the documents. Here, this is your signature. And the signature of the notary you obviously bribed. Do you think I won't recognize it? James was silent for a moment, then smiled. You don't understand, Margaret. I did this for your family. For Emily and the kids. You weren't planning on using that money, were you? I didn't. It was my life savings, my home, My future. Margaret raised her voice, feeling her patience fading. Let's be honest. James stood up. You've always thought only of yourself. I just wanted to keep my family safe, and now you're making an enemy out of me. An enemy. James, you stole everything from me, and you're not even sorry. Her eyes filled with tears. Margaret, calm down. If you continue this farce, you will only make things worse. Do you really want to lose Emily because of this nonsense? These words were the last straw. Lose Emily. You've already driven her away from me, and now you want to make me feel guilty. You're a manipulator, James. James raised his voice sharply. I'm doing everything I can to keep our family alive, and you're just clinging to your past. Margaret stopped him. This is not your decision, James. This is my life, and I will take back what is mine. The conversation ended with James leaving the house, slamming the door. Anna Margaret was left alone in the room, feeling her heart clench with pain. She knew that after this, there would be no turning back. She would have to fight for her future, even if it meant losing her own daughter's trust. After the confrontation with James, Margaret's house was enveloped in an unusual peace. But this peace was not calming. It resembled the calm before the storm. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair, looking out the window, and her mind was racing. What am I going to do? She whispered to herself. Her heart ached not only from the loss, but also from the realization that her own daughter had supported James. She went through all her options: sue, rally friends and family to her side, or just give up and accept the situation. But every time she thought about giving up, years of hard work and savings came to mind. Margaret decided to turn to her longtime friend Linda. Linda had always been there for her, especially in her darkest times. You can't leave it like this, Margaret, Linda said, holding her hand tightly. It's your life, your money, and they have no right to it. But how, Emily? She's the only family I have. If I go against James, I'll lose her forever. Margaret felt her voice tremble. True love is not built on lies, Linda replied firmly. Emily needs to realize that James is not only manipulating you, but also her. Margaret began looking through old photos of Emily as a child. There was only love and joy in those pictures. Where did I go wrong? She thought. How could it be that the person I trusted turned my own daughter against me? These memories only made her more determined. She realized that she had to fight not only for her money, but also for justice. Margaret decided to take action. She called the lawyer Linda had recommended and made an appointment. Margaret, you have every reason to challenge these documents, the lawyer said as he looked through the papers. They are a clear forgery. We can start the process immediately. I'm ready, Margaret replied firmly, though her heart was sinking at the thought of how this would affect Emily. When she got home, Emily was standing at the door, her face grim. Mom, what are you going to do? Anna, she asked, crossing her arms. Emily, I have to protect myself, Margaret replied. Your husband has crossed the line. He has stolen my future. But this could destroy our family, cried Emily. Family? Are you talking about family when your husband is taking away everything I've built my whole life? Margaret's voice was full of pain. Margaret knew that her choice would not be easy. She could fight for justice, risking losing her daughter forever, or she could accept it, preserving the relationship but losing her self-respect. She took a deep breath and looked into Emily's eyes. I've always loved you, but that doesn't give you or James the right to destroy me. I won't stop. The next morning, Margaret received a call from her lawyer. He said the documents were ready to be filed with the court. But instead of being relieved, Margaret felt strangely worried. Maybe I missed something, she thought. Deciding to clear her head a bit, she went for a walk in the park, where she happened to meet an old friend, Henry. He was always the person who could give her good advice. You don't look happy, Margaret, he said, noticing her pensive look. I'm facing a difficult choice, Henry. Protect myself or try to save my family, she replied. Henry thought about it. Don't you think there is a third option? These words stuck in Margaret's head. When she returned home, She began to analyze the situation. She took out all the documents she had collected from her desk and looked at them for a long time. What if instead of fighting I do something they don't expect, she thought. Margaret decided to meet Emily and James again, but this time on her own terms. The next day, Margaret invited Emily and James to her home. Their reaction was cautious, but they came. I thought about everything that had happened, she began, and I decided that fighting would only divide us further. James looked confident, and Emily breathed a sigh of relief. Mom, I knew you would understand, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to leave it at that, Margaret added, her voice firm. Margaret pulled a new document out of her bag. I have decided to amend my will. James 10 setting? What do you mean? I'm creating a foundation that will distribute my assets to charity, education, and elderly care, she explained. Emily looked stunned. Mom, but why? It's your money, your family. My family had to respect me and my decisions, Margaret replied. This is my way of getting justice. James looked furious but remained silent. Emily could not hold back her tears. Mom, do you really want to lose me? I don't want to lose you, but I won't allow myself to be manipulated anymore, Margaret said firmly. She handed them copies of the documents. This is the final decision. It is up to you to decide if you can live with him. Emily stood up and left in silence, not even saying goodbye. James stayed sitting for a few more minutes and then said coldly, "You're going to regret this." As they left, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew that her decision was risky, but it was the only way to regain her dignity.